Welcome to my first video on this channel, and I have a feeling that some of you will hate it and some of you will like it. If you do happen to like it, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. We're going to be reading a book today, one that I've had since I was a child. It's probably my favorite book. It's The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. If you don't know what this book is about, it's kind of like a Harry Potter type book. If Harry Potter was homeless and had to fend for himself. It's wizards and magic, bards and music, and all that good fantasy stuff. So please, I'll try to make as few mistakes as I can, but if there are a few, my mistake. Please feel free to relax, sleep, or put it on as background audio, and please enjoy. Prologue. A silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees and set the inn sign creaking on its hooks. If there had been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with a conversation and laughter, the clatter and clamor one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. If there had been music. But no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things. And so the silence remained. Inside the Waystone, a pair of men huddled at a corner of the bar. They drank with a quiet determination, avoiding serious discussions of troubling news, and in doing this, they added a small, sullen silence to the larger, hollow one. It made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wooden floor and foot, and in the rough, splintering barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the black stone hearth that held the heat of a long-dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth running along the grain of the bar. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were distant and dark, and he moved with a subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, wrapping the others inside itself. It was deep and wide as an autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river-smooth stone, and it was the patient, flower-cut sound of a man who is waiting to die. Chapter 1. A Place for Demons. It was filling night, and the usual crowd had gathered at the Waystone Inn. 5 wasn't much of a crowd, but 5 was as many as the Waystone ever saw these days. Times being what they were. Old Cobb filling his role as storyteller at Advice Dispensary. The men at the bar sipped their drinks and listened. In the back room, a young innkeeper stood out of sight behind the door, smiling as he listened to the details of a familiar story. When he awoke, Taborlin the Great found himself locked in a high tower. They had taken his sword and stripped him of his tools, key and coin, and candle. But that weren't even the worst of it, you see. Cobb paused for effect, 'cause the lamps on the walls were all burning blue. Graham, Jake, and Shep nodded to themselves. The three friends had grown up together, listening to Cobb's stories and ignoring his advice. Cobb peered closely at the newer, more attentive member of his small audience, the smith's apprentice. "Do you know what that meant, boy?" Everyone called the smith's apprentice boy, despite the fact that he was a half-hand taller than anyone there. Small towns being what they are, he would most likely remain boy until his beard filled out, or he bloodied someone's nose over the matter. The boy gave a slow nod. The Chandrian. "That's right," Cobb said so approvingly. "The Chandrian. Everyone knows that the blue fire is one of their signs." "Now he was... But how'd they find him?" the boy interrupted. "And why didn't they kill him when they had the chance?" "Hush now, or you'll get all the answers before the end," Jake said. "Just let him tell it." "No need for all that, Jake," Graham said. "The boy's just curious. Drink your drink." "I drank me drink already," Jake grumbled. "I needed another, but the innkeeper's still skinning rats in the back room." He raised his voice and knocked his empty mug hollowly along the top of the mahogany bar. "Hoy, we're thirsty men in here." The innkeeper appeared with 5 bowls of stew and 2 warm round loaves of bread. He poured more beer for Jake, Shep, and old Cobb, moving with an air of bustling efficiency. The story was set aside while the men tended to their dinners. Old Cobb tucked away his bowl of stew with the predatory efficiency of a lifetime bachelor. The others were still blowing steam off their bowls when he finished the last of his loaf and returned to the story. Now Taborlin needed to escape, but when he looked around, he saw that the cell had no door, no windows, and all around him there was nothing but smooth, hard stone. It was a cell no man had ever escaped. But Taborlin knew the names of all things, and so all things were his to command. He said to the stone, "Break," and the stone broke. The wall tore like a piece of paper, and through that hole Taborlin could see the sky and breathe the sweet spring air. He stepped to the edge, looked down, and without a second thought, he stepped into the open air. The boy's eyes went wide. "He didn't." Cobb nodded seriously. So Taborlin fell, but he did not despair, for he knew the name of the wind, and so the wind obeyed. He spoke to the wind, and it cradled and caressed him. It bore him to the ground as gently as a puff of thistledown, and set him on his feet softly as a mother's kiss. And when he got to the ground and felt his side where they stabbed him, he saw that it weren't hardly a scratch. Now maybe it was just a piece of luck. Cobb tapped the side of his nose knowingly, or maybe it had something to do with the amulet that he was wearing underneath his shirt. "What amulet?" the boy asked eagerly, through a mouthful of stew. Old Cobb leaned back on his stool, glad for the chance to elaborate. A few days earlier, Taborlin had met a tinker on the side of the road, and even though Taborlin didn't have much to eat, he shared his dinner with the old man. "Right sensible thing to do," Graham said quietly to the boy. "Everyone knows a tinker pays for kindness twice." No, Jake grumbled. "Get it right. A tinker's advice pays kindness twice. The innkeeper then spoke for the first time that night. Actually, you're missing more than half, he said, standing in the doorway beside the bar. A tinker's debt is always paid, once for any simple trade, twice for freely given aid, thrice for any insult made. The men at the bar seemed almost surprised to see Coat standing there. He had been coming to the Waystone Inn every filling night for 4 months, and Coat had never interjected anything of his own before. Not that you could expect anything else, really. He'd only been in town for a year or so. He was still a stranger. The smith's apprentice had lived here since he was 11, and he was still referred to as that Ranish boy, as if Ranish was some foreign country and not a town less than 30 miles away. It's just something I heard once, Coat said to fill the silence, obviously embarrassed. Old Cobb nodded before he cleared his throat and launched back into the story. Now this amulet was worth a whole bucket of gold royals, but on account of Topolin's kindness, the tinker sold it to him for nothing but an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. It was black as a winter's night, and as cold as ice to touch, but so long as it was around his neck, Topolin would be safe from the harm of evil things. I'd give a good piece for a thing like that, such as these days, Shep said darkly. He had drunk most and talked the least over the course of the evening. Everyone knew that something bad had happened out on his farm last kindling night, but since they were good friends, they knew better than to press him for the details. At least not this early in the evening, not as sober as they were. Aye, who wouldn't? Old Cobb said judiciously, taking a long drink. I didn't know the Chandrian were demons, the boy said. I'd heard. They ain't demons, Jake said firmly. They're the first 6 people to refuse Telu's choice of the path, and he cursed them to wander the corners. Are you telling this story, Jacob Walker? Cobb said sharply. 'Cause if you are, then I'll let you get on with it. The 2 men glared at each other for a long moment, and eventually Jake looked away, muttering something that could conceivably have been an apology. Cobb turned to look at the boy. That's the mystery of the Chandrian, he explained. Where did they come from? And where do they go after they've done the bloody deeds? Are they men who've sold their souls? Demons, spirits? Nobody knows. Cobb shot Jake a profoundly disdainful look, though every half-wit claims he knows. The story fell further into bickering at this point about the nature of the Chandrian, the signs that showed their presence to the wary, and whether the amulet would protect Topolin from bandits or mad dogs, or falling off a horse. Things were getting heated when the front door banged open. Jake looked over. It's about time you got in, Carter. Tell this damn fool the difference between a demon and a dog. Everybody... Jake stopped mid-sentence and rushed to the door. God's body, what happened to you? Carter stepped into the light, his face pale and smeared with blood. He clutched an old saddle blanket to his chest. It was an odd, awkward shape, as if it was wrapped around a tangle of kindling sticks. His friends jumped off the stools and hurried over to the side of him. I'm fine, he said, as he made his slow way into the common room. His eyes were wild around the edges, like a skittish horse. I'm fine. He dropped the bundled blanket onto the nearest table, where it knocked hard against the wood, as if it was full of stones. His clothes were crisscrossed with long, straight cuts, and his grey shirt hung in loose tatters. Graham tried to ease him into a chair. Mother of God, sit down, Carter. What happened? Sit down. Carter shook his head stubbornly. I told you, I'm fine. I'm not hurt. Not that bad, anyway. How many were there? Graham said. One, Carter said. But it's not what you think. God damn it, I told you, Carter. Cobb burst out, with the sort of frightened anger you only relatives and close friends can muster. I told you for months now, you can't go out alone, not even as far as Baden. It ain't safe. Jack laid a hand on the old man's arm. Just take a seat, Graham said, trying to steer Carter into a chair. Let's get that shirt off you and get you cleaned up. Carter shook his head. I got caught up a little, but the blood is mostly Nellie's. I jumped on her, killed her, about 2 miles outside of town, past the old stone bridge. A moment of serious silence followed the news. The Smith's apprentice laid a sympathetic hand on Carter's shoulder. Damn, that's hard. She was gentle as a lamb, too. Never tried to bite or kick when you brought her in for shoes. The best horse in town. Damn. He trailed off. Damn, I don't know what to say. He looked around helplessly. Cobb finally managed to free himself from Jake. I told you, he repeated, shaking a finger in Carter's direction. There's folks out lately that would kill you for a pair of pennies, let alone a horse and a cart. What are you going to do now? Pull it yourself? There was a moment of uncomfortable quiet. Jake and Cobb glared at each other, while the rest seemed at a loss for words, unsure how to comfort their friend. The innkeeper moved carefully through the silence, arms full. He stepped nimbly around Shep and began to arrange some items on a nearly table. A bowl of hot water, shears, some fresh clean linen, a few glass bottles, needle and gut. This would never have happened if he'd listened to me in the first place, old Cobb muttered. Jake tried to quiet him, but Cobb brushed the younger man aside. I'm just telling the truth. It's a damn shame about Nellie, but he better listen now or he'll end up dead. You don't get lucky twice with those sort of men. Carter's mouth made a thin line. He reached out and pulled the edge of the bloody blanket. Whatever was inside flipped over and snagged on the cloth. Carter tugged harder, and there was a clatter like a bag of flat river stones upended onto the tabletop. It was a spider, as large as a wagon wheel and as black as slate. The smith's apprentice jumped backward and hit a table, knocking it over, and almost falling to the ground himself. Cobb's face went slack. Graham, Shep, and Jake made wordless, startled sounds and moved away, raising their hands to their faces. Carter took a step backwards that was almost like a nervous twitch. Silence filled the room like a cold sweat. The innkeeper frowned. They can't have made it this far west yet, he said softly. If not for the silence, it was unlikely that anyone would have heard him, but they did. Their eyes pulled away from the thing on the table to stare mutely at the red-haired man. Jake found his voice first. You know what this is. The innkeeper's eyes were distant. Scrail, he said distractedly. I thought the mountains. Scrail, Jake broke in. Blackened body of god coat. You've seen these things before. What? The red-haired innkeeper looked up sharply, as if suddenly remembering where he was. Oh, no, of course not. Seeing that he was the only one within arm's length of the dark thing, he took a measured step away. Just something I heard. They stared at him. Do you remember the trader that came by about 2 span ago? They all nodded. The bastard tried to charge me 10 pennies for a half-pound of salt, Cobb said reflexively, repeating the complaint for perhaps the 100th time. Wish I'd bought some, Jake mumbled. Graham nodded a silent agreement. He was a filthy shim, Cobb spat, seeming to find comfort in the familiar words. I might pay 2 in a tight time, but 10 is robbery. Not if there are more of those things on the road, Shep said darkly. All eyes went back to the thing on the table. He told me he'd heard of them over near Melcombe, Code said quickly, watching everyone's faces as they studied the thing on the table. I thought he was just trying to drive up his prices. What else did he say? Carter asked. The innkeeper looked thoughtful for a moment, then shrugged. I didn't get the whole story. He was only in town for a couple of hours. I don't like spiders, the smith's apprentice said. He remained on the other side of the table, some 15 feet away. Cover it up. It's not a spider, Jake said. It's got no eyes. It's got no mouth either, Carter pointed out. How does it eat? What does it eat? Shep said darkly. The innkeeper continued to eye the thing curiously. He leaned closer, stretching out a hand. Everyone edged away farther from the table. Careful, Carter said. Its feet are sharp like knives. More like razors, Kurt said. His long fingers brushed against the thing's black, featureless body. It's smooth and hard like pottery. Don't go messing with it, the smith's apprentice said. Moving carefully, the innkeeper took one of the long, smooth legs and tried to break it with both hands. Not pottery, he amended. He set it against the edge of the table and leaned his weight against it. It broke with a sharp crack, more like stone. How did it get all these cracks? He pointed at the thin fractures that grazed the smooth black surface of the body. Nellie fell on it, Carter said. It jumped out of a tree and started to climb all over her, cutting her up with its feet. It moved so fast I didn't even know what was going on. Carter finally sank into the chair at Graham's urging. She got tangled into the harness and fell on it, broke some of its legs. Then it came after me, got on me, and started crawling all over. He crossed his arms in front of his bloody chest and shuddered. I managed to get it off me and stomped it as hard as I could. Then it got on me again. He trailed off, his face ashen. The innkeeper nodded to himself as he continued to prod the thing. There's no blood, no organs. It's just grey inside. He poked it with a finger, like a mushroom. Great Taylor, just leave it alone, the smith's apprentice begged. Sometimes spiders twitch after you kill them. Listen to yourselves, Cobb said scathingly. Spiders don't get as big as pigs. You know what this is. He looked around, making eye contact with each of them. It's a demon. They looked at the broken thing. Oh, come now, Jake said, disagreeing mostly out of habit. It's not like... He made an articulate gesture. You can't just... Everyone knew what he was thinking. Certainly there were demons in the world, but they were like Telu's angels. They were like heroes and kings. They belonged in stories, and they belonged out there. To burn in the great cord of fire and lightning to destroy demons. Telu broke them in his hands and sent them howling into the nameless void. Your childhood friend didn't stomp one to death on the road to Ben and Bert. It was ridiculous. Kurt ran his hand through his red hair and broke the silence. There's only one way to tell for sure, he said, reaching into his pocket. Iron or fire. He brought out a bulging leather purse. And in the name of God, Graham pointed out, demons fear 3 things: cold iron, clean fire, and the holy name of God. The innkeeper's mouth pressed itself into a straight line that was not quite a frown. Of course, he said as he emptied his purse onto the table, and then fingered through the jumble of coins. Heavy silver talents and thin silver bits, copper jots, broken halfpennies, and iron drabs. Does anyone have a shim? Just use a drab, Jake said. That's good iron. I don't want good iron. A drab has too much carbon in it. It's almost steel. He's right, the smith's apprentice said. Except it's not carbon. You use coke to make steel. Coke and lime. The innkeeper nodded deferringly to the boy. You know best, young master. It's your business after all. His long fingers finally found a shim in the pile of coins, and he held it up. Here we are. What will it do? Jake asked. Iron kills demons. Cobb's voice was uncertain. But this one's already dead. It might not do anything. Only one way to find out. The innkeeper met each of their eyes briefly, as if measuring them. Then he turned purposefully back to the table, and he edged farther away. Cobb pressed the iron shim into the black side of the creature, and there was a short, sharp, crackling sound, like a pine log snapping in a hot fire. Everyone startled, then relaxed when the black thing remained motionless. Cobb and the others exchanged shaky smiles, like boys spooked by a ghost story. The smiles were sour, as the room filled with a sweet, acrid smoke of rotting flowers and burning hair. The innkeeper pressed the shim into the table with a sharp click. Well, he said, brushing his hands against his apron. I guess that settles that. What do we do now? Hours later, the innkeeper stood in the doorway of the waystone and let his eyes relax to the darkness. Footprints of lamplight and the inn's windows fell across the dirt road and the doors of the smithy across the way. It was not a large road or well travelled, and it didn't seem to lead anywhere, as some roads do. The innkeeper drew a breath of autumn air and looked around restlessly, as if waiting for something to happen. He called himself Coat. He had chosen the name carefully when he came to this place. He had taken a new name for most of the usual reasons, and for a few of the unusual ones as well, not the least of which was the fact that names were important. Looking up, he saw 1,000 stars glittering in the deep velvet of a night with no moon. He knew them all, the stories and the names. He knew them in a familiar way, the way he knew his own hands. Looking down, Coat sighed without knowing it and went back inside. He locked the door and shuttered the wide windows of the inn, as if to distance himself from the stars and the varied names. He swept the floor methodically, catching all the corners. He washed the tables and the bar, moving with a patient efficiency at the end of an hour's work. The water in his bucket was still clean enough for a lady to wash her hands in, and finally he pulled a stool from behind the bar and began to polish the vast array of bottles nestled between the 2 huge barrels. He wasn't nearly as crisp and efficient about this chore as he had been with the others, and it soon became obvious that the polishing was only excuse to touch and hold. He even hummed a little, although no, he did not realize it, and would have stopped himself had he known. As he turned the bottles in his long, graceful hands, the familiar motion eased a few tired lines from his face, making him seem younger. Certainly not yet 30, not even near 30. Young for an innkeeper, young for a man with so many tired lines remaining on his face. Coat came to the top of the stairs and opened the door. His room was austere, almost monkish. There was a black stone fireplace in the center of the room, a pair of chairs and a small desk. The only other furniture was a narrow bed with a large dark chest at its foot. Nothing decorated the walls or covered the wooden floor. There were footsteps in the hall, and a young man stepped into the room, carrying a bowl of stew that steamed and smelled of pepper. He was dark and charming, with a quick smile and cunning eyes. "You haven't been this late in weeks," he said, and handing the bowl over. There must have been good stories tonight, Reshi." Reshi was another one of the innkeeper's names, a nickname of sorts. The sound of it tugged one of the corners of his mouth into a wry smile as he sank into the deep chair in front of the fire. "So what did you learn today, Bast?" "Today, Master, I learned why great lovers have better eyesight than great scholars." "And why is that, Bast?" Kurt asked, amusement touching the edges of his voice. Bast closed the door and returned to sit in the second chair, turning it to face his teacher and the fire. He moved with a strange delicacy and grace, as if he was close to dancing. "Well, Reshi, all the rich books are found inside where the light is bad, but lovely girls tend to be out in the sunshine, and therefore must be easier to study without risk of injuring one's eyes." Kurt nodded, but an exceptionally clever student could take a book outside, thus bettering himself without fear of lessening his much-loved facility of sight. "I thought the same thing, Reshi, being, of course, an exceptionally clever student. Of course. But when I found a place in the sun where I could read, a beautiful girl came along and kept me from doing anything of the sort." Bast finished with a flourish. Kurt sighed. "Am I correct in assuming you didn't manage to read any of Selim Tinshor today?" Bast managed to look somewhat ashamed. Looking into the fire, Kurt tried to assume a stern face and failed. "Ah, Bast, I hoped the way she was a lovely and warm wind in the shade. I am a bad teacher to say it, but I am glad. I don't feel up to long bouts of lessons right now." There was a moment of silence. Carter was attacked by a skraeling tonight. Bast's easy smile fell away like a cracked mask, leaving his face stricken and pale. The skrael. He came halfway to his feet, as if he was bolted from the room, and then gave it an embarrassing frown, and forced himself to look back down into his chair. "How do you know? Who found his body?" "He's still alive, Bast. He brought it back, and there is only one." "There's no such thing as only one skraeling," Bast said flatly, "and you know that." "I know," Kurt said. "The fact remains that there was only one, and he killed it," Bast said. "It couldn't have been a skraeling, maybe." "Bast, it was one of the skrael. I saw it." Kurt gave him a serious look. "He was lucky, that's all, and even so he was badly hurt. 48 stitches. I used nearly all my gut." Kurt picked up the bowl of stew. If anyone asked, tell them my great father was a caravan guard who taught me how to clean and stitch a wound. They were too shocked to ask about it tonight, but tomorrow some of them might get curious, and I do not want that. He blew into his bowl, raising a cloud of steam across his face. "What did you do with the body?" "I didn't do anything with it," Kurt said pointingly. "I am just an innkeeper. This sort of thing is quite beyond me." "Reshi, you can't just let them muddle through this on their own." Kurt sighed. "They took it to the priest. He did all the right things for all the wrong reasons." Bast opened his mouth, But Kurt continued before he could say anything. Yes, I made sure the pit was deep enough. Yes, I made sure there was rowan wood in the fire, and yes, I made sure I burned it long and hot before they buried it. I'm not an idiot, you know. Bass visibly relaxed, settling back into his chair. I know you're not Rishi, but I wouldn't trust half the people to piss Leeward without help. I can't imagine why there was only one. Maybe they died coming over the mountains, Code suggested. All but this one. It's possible, Bast admitted reluctantly. Maybe it was the storm from a couple of days back, Code pointed out. A real wagon tipper, as we used to say back in the troop. All the wind and rain might have scattered one loose from the back. I like your first idea better, Rishi, Bast said uncomfortably. 3 or 4 Scrayer will go through this town like a hot knife through butter. More like several hot knives through several dozen farmers, Bass said dryly. These people can't defend themselves, and I bet there aren't 6 swords in this whole town. Not that swords would do much good against the Scrael anyways. There was a long moment of thoughtful silence. After a moment, Bass began to fidget. Any news? Kurt shook his head. They didn't get to news tonight. Carter's disruptance made sure of that. The business would have been nice. Busyness would have been nice. Anything would have been nice. And they sat for a long moment. Kurt was scowling down into the bowl of stew in his hands, his eyes far away. It must be awful for you, Bast, he said at last. You must be numb with boredom. Bast shrugged. There are few young wives in this town, a scattering of daughters. He grinned like a child. I tend to make my own fun. That's good, Bast. There was another silence, and Kurt took another spoonful. They thought it was a demon, you know. Bast shrugged. It might as well be Rishi. It's probably the best thing for them to think. I know, I encourage them in fact. But you know what this means. He met Bast's eyes. The blacksmith is going to be doing brisk business in the next couple of days. Oh, I won't blame if you want to leave, Bast. You have better places to be than this. Bast's expression was shocked. I couldn't leave Rishi. He opened his closed mouth a few times, at a loss for words. Who else would teach me? Kurt grinned, and for a moment his face showed how truly young he was. Behind the weary lines of the placid innkeeper's expression, he looked no older than his dark-haired companion. Who indeed? He gestured toward the door with his spoon. Go do your reading then, or bother someone else's daughter. I'm sure you have better things to do than watch me eat. Actually, be gone, demon, Kurt said, switching to a thickly accented Temic through a mouthful of stew. Tehus antosa iha. Bast burst into startled laughter and made an obscene gesture with one hand. Kurt swallowed and changed languages. Roy te denelian. Oh, come now, Bast reproached, his smile fading away. That's just insulting. By earth and stone, I abjure you. Kurt dipped his fingers into the cup by his side and flicked droplets casually in Bast's direction. Glamour be banished. With cider, Bast managed to look amused and annoyed at the same time as he dabbed his bead of liquid from the front of his shirt. This better not stain. Kurt took up another bite of his dinner. Go soak it. If the situation becomes desperate, I recommend you avail yourself on the numerous solvent formulae in Sand and Shore. Chapter 13, I believe. Fine. Bast stood and walked to the door, stepping with a strange casual grace. Call if you need anything. Kurt ate slowly, mopping up the last of his stew with a piece of bread. He looked out the window as he ate, or tried to as the lamplight turned into its mirror-like image against the dark behind it. His eyes wandered the room restlessly. The fireplace was made of the same black rock as the one downstairs. It stood in the center of the room, a minor feat of engineering in which Coate was rather proud. The bed was small, little more than a cot, and if you were to touch it, you would find the mattress almost non-existent. A skilled observer might notice there was something his gaze avoided, the same way you avoid meeting the eyes of an old lover at a formal dinner, or that of an old enemy sitting across the room. Coate tried to relax, failed, fidgeted, sighed, shifted in his seat, and without willing to, his eyes fell on the chest at the foot of his bed. It was made of roa, a very rare, heavy wood, dark as cool and smooth as polished glass. Prized by perfumers and alchemists, a piece the size of your thumb was easily worth gold. To have a whole chest made of it went way beyond extravagant. The chest was sealed 3 times. It had a lock of iron, a lock of copper, and a lock that could not be seen. Tonight the wood filled the room with the almost imperceptible aroma of citrus and quenching iron. When Coate's eyes fell on the chest, they did not dart away quickly. They did not slide slyly to the side, as if he would pretend that he wasn't there at all. But in a moment of looking, his face regained all the lines that the simple pleasures of the day had slowly smoothed away. The comfort of his bottles and books was erased in a second, leaving nothing behind his eyes but emptiness and ache. For a moment fierce longing and regret weared across his face. Then they were gone, replaced by the weary face of an innkeeper, a man who called himself Coate. He sighed again without knowing it, and pushed himself to his feet. It was a long time before he walked past the chest to his bed. Once in bed, it was a long time before he slept. As Coate had guessed, they came back to the Waystone the next night for dinner and drinks. There were a few half-hearted attempts at stories, but they died out quickly. No one ever really in the mood. So it was still early in the evening when the discussion turned to matters of greater import. They chewed over the rumours that have come into town, most of them troubling. The penitent king was having a difficult time with the rebels in Resavac. This caused some concern, but only in a general way. The Resavac was a long way off, and even Cope, the most worldly of them, would be hard-pressed to find it on a map. They discussed the war in their own terms, and Cope pretended that a third levy tax after the harvest were in. No one argued, though, there hadn't been 3 bleed a year in living memory. Jake guessed the harvest would be good enough so that the third levy wouldn't break most families, except the Bentleys, who were on the hard times anyway, and the Orisons, whose sheep kept disappearing, and Crazy Martin, who had planted all his barley this year. Every farmer with half a brain had planted beans, and that was one good thing about all of this. The fighting, the soldiers, they all ate from their stock. After a few more drinks, deeper concerns were voiced. Deserter soldiers and other opportunities were thick on the roads, making even short trips risky. The roads were always bad, of course, in the same way that winter was always cold. You complained, took sensible precautions, and got on with the business of living your life. But this was different. Over the past 2 months, the roads had become so bad that people had to stop complaining. The last caravan had 2 wagons and 4 guards. The merchant had been asking 10 pennies for a half-pound of salt, 15 for a loaf of sugar. He didn't have any pepper or cinnamon or chocolate. He did have 1 small sack of coffee, but he wanted 2 silver talents for that. At first, people had laughed at his prices. Then, when he held firm, folks spat and cursed at him. It had been 2 span ago. 22 days. There had not been another serious traitor since, even though this was the season for it. So despite the third levy tax looming large in everyone's minds, people were looking in the purses and wishing they'd bought a little something, just in case the snow came early. No one spoke of the previous night or of the thing they burned and buried. Other folks were talking, of course. The town was alive with gossip, and Carter's wounds ensured that the stories were taken half seriously, but not much more than half. The word demon was being spoken, but it was with the smiles of half-hidden faces behind raised hands. Only the 6 friends had seen the thing before it was burned. One of them had been wounded, and the others had been drinking. The priest had seen it too, but it was his job to see demons. Demons were good for his business. The innkeeper had seen it too, apparently, but he wasn't from around here. He couldn't know the truth that was so apparent to everyone born and raised in this little town. Stories were told here, but they happened somewhere else. This was not a place for demons. Besides, things were bad enough without borrowing trouble. Cobb and the rest knew that there was no sense talking about it. Trying to convince folk would only make them laugh stock. Like crazy Martin, who had been trying to dig a well inside of his own house for years. Still, each of them bought a piece of cold wrought iron from the smith, heavy as they could swing, and none of them said that they were thinking. Instead, they complained that the roads were bad and getting worse. They talked about merchants having deserters and levies, and not enough salt to last the winter. They reminisced that 3 years ago no one would have ever seen or thought of locking their doors at night, let alone barring them. The conversation took a downward turn from there, and even though none of them said what they were thinking, the evening ended on a grim note. Most evenings did, these days anyway. Times being what they were. And that concludes chapter 1. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this type of video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and if you made it to the end, thank you a ton. Farewell. See you in part 2.